Man, we are week 2 for Family Month. We kicked it off last week, which was a lot of fun. One of the things that we are always trying to be intentional about is figuring out what does it look like for us to not only grow spiritually, but also then to grow relationally and emotionally. And there are ways that we get to balance these things out. And so that's what we are talking about in this series. Is my mic still on? Feels like it is, but sweet. It was probably about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. We went to visit some friends back in Des Moines. We lived in Des Moines, Iowa for a number of years. Hey, Mace. Hey, bro. What are you doing? You can go hang out there if you want. Family month, you guys. Family service, family month. But we went back in Des Moines and we were visiting some friends. One of our great friends, Jen, it was her birthday and she had this huge birthday party and it was in this backyard, a house that she owns. And there was probably maybe 30 or 40 adults in this backyard hanging out. There was like a taco man. There was just all kinds of really fun stuff happening. And most of the people, not most, maybe half the people there had kids. And so the whole time there was these kids running around and the parents were kind of paying attention, like when you go to a birthday party and you're like half paying attention to the children you're responsible for and then half trying to also just have a good time. And so we're paying attention, watching the kids, all the parents are there, et cetera, et cetera. So time goes on and it was as if all at one moment, the parents all realized that none of the kids were there anymore. Like none of them. They all had disappeared. And we obviously all got like a little bit freaked out. We're like, where's the kids? And so you can see kind of the parents like all split off into different areas to go look for them. And then we hear this loud music and screaming. And we were just very confused and a little bit nervous about that. And so we kind of followed it. And it sounded like it was coming from the house. So we went in the back of the house. And then in the Midwest, they have these things called basements. They don't have those out here. And so then we realized like, oh, I think it's coming from the basement. But the lights were off in the basement. But we could hear all of this screaming and laughing. And we were like, this is the beginning to every horror movie. And so we go downstairs and all of the kids that were at the party were downstairs. They had found glow sticks and put on music and they were having like a rave in the basement, just like running around in circles, laughing, screaming. And we all were like, oh, this is funny. And we were worried and like, what in the world is happening? And then my beautiful, sweet, innocent 9-year-old son jumps into the middle of the circle because apparently he was the one that led the charge and he was like, everybody scream! And all these kids are just, I'm like, a little bit embarrassed, like this is not my son. This is, I don't know whose kid this is, but there's this piece for us where we realized all of a sudden this moment, this isn't necessarily what I would have chosen. This isn't necessarily the way I would have wanted him to be entertained by rallying all of the kids to have a basement rave in the Midwest. But there are these moments in our lives where we have these kind of recognitions, these moments of clarity, if you will, where we recognize that we need to make some adjustments because our natural instincts or our natural responses or our go-to habits, they are problematic. Maybe if they're not problematic now, they will be problematic if they continue. Whether it's a natural kind of, we always are leaning one way, we're always handling conflict in one way, we're always coping with stress or anxiety one way. A lot of times these natural or habitual kind of instincts that we have, they can be really problematic. The realization is true for individuals. This can be true in a relationship, whether you are dating, whether you are married. You can have these types of realizations of like our natural tendency is going to cause issues. This can be true with friends and roommates. This can be true in immediate families or with extended families. Some of us, as we grow older, we start to get some clarity on our family of origin and siblings or parents or cousins or whatever the relationships you have may be. And I just wonder if you've ever thought, maybe, I'm not sure if this is who we want to be. It's who we've been. It's who we've kind of always been. And I'm just getting a sense of clarity that I'm not sure that this is really who I want us to continue to be. I know I've had that thought even over the last 7 months. I've had a number of these moments in my own life earlier, it was probably about February, maybe. This was before quarantine even started. I started losing my mind, so that's how that went. But I started realizing that I had just less patience with my kids than I had ever had before, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't really know what was triggering it, but I just started realizing that I was getting frustrated and snapping faster than I wanted to. And there's a reality in that moment of saying, well, it'll be fine. I'll figure it out, I'm sure. Or it could be like, if I don't address this, this could continue on, and this could be how my kids remember me. This could be the perspective that my kids have of me. And so there's a choice there of saying, this is not ideal for now, and so I need to figure out what can I do to address it. And so I started working on it and started engaging in counseling again and trying to figure out like what is going on mentally in my own mind. Over the last few months, realized even that my natural tendencies with my emotional health were not going to allow me to become who I most want to be. I realized in my spiritual life, my default when it comes to faith, my default, and usually there's kind of two categories of people. You have people that are very disciplined and I'll say religious, but not in a just in a sense of like there's a very specific process they follow every single day. And then you have people that are a bit more kind of like a hippie, just like free flowing. And I tend to be a little bit more on this side of like, man, I'm in a relationship with God, and there is a relational aspect to that. And what I've realized over the last couple months is that some of the comfort that I have there is actually not allowing me to be as close with God as if I were more disciplined in some of those things. So I've had to make some adjustments there. Even this week, we launched the marriage course this last Thursday night. We have almost 30 couples signed up in this course to develop their relationships. And as we were watching this teaching, Ez and I had a number of moments where we realized, like, oh, we should probably work on that. And there was a number of couples that came up to us and were like, hey, we're not getting many of these questions right. We're figuring this stuff out. And so there's this realization of this sense of how things are. They may not be terrible. They may not be ideal. They may not be the truest representation of what we want, but we need to change them if we want to experience the wholeness, the fullness of life, the fullness of relationships, the individual health that we truly long for. Unfortunately, even sometimes when we become aware of these things, we become aware of what we don't like or these kind of aspects that we want to change, we can get clarity on it, but most of us still don't change because change is hard. We tend to do what we're used to, even if what we're used to is unhealthy, even if what we're used to is going to lead us in a path or in a direction that is broken or problematic. We as humans, we tend to do what we are used to, even when it's unhealthy. This is the way our brain works. Our brain wants what is familiar. Neuroscience, they have actually discovered that our brains, we have little cruise controls where there are certain triggers and we just automatically do things because it takes less brain power to do those things. Our brain likes it that way. Our brain is always trying to save energy, which is why it is difficult oftentimes to do things a new way, to remember to do something different, because your brain is literally designed to try and save as much power, energy, thought process as possible. Familiar feels safe, but sometimes what feels safe or familiar can be really unhealthy. It can be destructive. What happens if what feels most familiar for you and your family is verbally cutting each other down? This is what feels familiar. This is the context that I was raised in. We just have really cutting conversations. Does that mean that because it's familiar, it's okay? What happens if what is familiar in your family or in your life is constantly being in debt and always shuffling or managing some kind of debt? What if what's familiar or what feels safe to you is stuffing your feelings down or taking your feelings out on others? What if what's familiar to you is always demanding or requiring your own way? Whatever each of our things are, there are these moments where we have to recognize just because it's familiar or easy or the way it's always been or the family that I grew up in or the way that I'm comfortable, just because of these things, it does not mean that it's right. And it does not mean it's going to get me to where I ultimately want to go. Oftentimes when we do this stuff, we recognize that it's bad, but it's also comforting. It's toxic, but it's familiar. This is a problem that has always existed. The Exodus story in the scripture, the story of the Exodus has always functioned as a way to illuminate this reality that if we are left to our own instincts, if we're left to our own kind of natural inclinations, our own habits that we have formed, if we are left to these things alone, we will get it wrong. The Exodus story paints this picture. Even though God uses Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, they're no longer technically slaves. The Israelites still had oppression in their lives. There were still these mindsets, these ways that they had been living for hundreds of years, that even though they were free now, they were no longer slaves. Even though that things had changed, their mind and their attitudes and their hearts, it still continued to live in a different way. After being enslaved for hundreds of years in Egypt, they had picked up customs and habits and thought patterns that were sabotaging to who God intended for them to be. They were deeply ingrained in their lives and in their minds because they had lived this way for hundreds of years in Egypt, hundreds of years, multiple generations in slavery in Egypt. I think that we have all picked up some bad habits from people we've hung out with. That's people over months or a couple years. We have picked up habits or personality traits from them. A lot of people give my wife a hard time because she always dances like this, which isn't the problem. But then other people, they start to dance like this, and they're like, now I'm dancing like Ez. It's like the slumber party arms all over it's like, and that's just after hanging out with someone for a little while. Israel lived in Egypt in slavery. They were forced to exist in a certain kind of setting for hundreds of years. So you can only begin to imagine the family history, the things that were ingrained in their mind, the broken ways of thinking, the unhealthy aspects that were in their minds. God's best for Israel could not be found in their cultural default settings, and it won't for us either. God's best, what he wanted for them, his deepest desire for them to be healthy, to be whole, to be close with him, they couldn't just assume they would find it because their cultural default settings had been totally shifted to something different. Some of us have realized that this is true with our kids, that their factory default settings are not so great. We can't laugh too much because we are the factory. They take on our personalities. They learn the things that we have taught them or we have modeled them. But this is also true in our dating relationships and in our friendships and even for ourselves. We recognize that some of these default ways are not going to get us where we want to go. So here's what God did. He invited Moses into a conversation. He invited Moses into a mountaintop conversation, and he gave him guidelines to give to the people of Israel after they had escaped from Egypt. He gave them actionable values to ensure that they were moving in the right direction, to ensure that they had a clear path or a way or a system to move away from the hundreds of years of doing things and thinking and believing one way. He wanted to give them a clear path to find health. You may know these things as the 10 Commandments. This is not a sermon on the 10 Commandments. We will read through them in just a second, but this is about the conversation of why God gave the 10 Commandments to Israel. It's in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3 is where it starts, and I shortened some of these to make sure we could get through all of them, but here's the 10 Commandments. It says, "You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind. You must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy." The first 4 of these 10 commandments are all about our relationship with God, and the last 6 are all about our relationship with others. He goes on, he says, "Honor your father and mother." Can I get an amen? I expected a bit more passion from the parents in the room, but you must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. You must not covet. Now, these 10 commandments, in some ways, they feel like, yeah, don't murder. That's a pretty good one. Like that's not groundbreaking. But at the time when God gave these commandments to Moses, everything was different. The culture they lived in, the way that they had to exist, the way they related to each other, the way that they had been related to by Egypt. So why did God give these 10 commandments? Is it because if they followed the 10 commandments and then they would get eternal life? If all you do is follow these 10 rules, you get eternal life? Is it because God didn't want them to have any fun, which is what I always thought growing up? Is it because if they followed the 10 commandments, they wouldn't have any problems in their life? The reason that God set these 10 commandments in place is because people need parameters. And these parameters are not the point. The law is not the point, but it points us in the right direction. Literally, as I was writing this yesterday, I was reviewing my notes and kind of filling out stuff. I always do this the day before I teach, kind of get back into it. I'm like writing things, shuffling things around. As I'm writing this phrase yesterday in my notes, parameters aren't the point, but they point us in the right direction. People need parameters. People need guidelines. In that moment, my 5-year-old punched my 9-year-old because he took his water bottle. You've got to be kidding me. We have a commandment about this in our house. And it's not that hitting is always the wrong thing, although I say it is never the first option. There are some times where I want him to be able to defend himself. There's things I want him to be able to understand, but it is not the go-to option. And if I just all of a sudden allow him to, hey, you took my water bottle, and then give his brother a right hook, this is going to be an issue. And so we have a guideline in our house that says we don't hit. We use words. We start off with words, kind words. We ask nicely. If somebody is bullying or being unfair, then we can pull in an adult. And then I have talked with specifically my older son about what number on the list is self-defense in that ranking. We all need these guidelines. We all need something to point us in the right direction. And each of these 10 commandments were designed specifically to point Israel in a different direction than their culture and their history was taking them. It was a path away from their unhealthy impulses. I'll give you guys a couple examples. The first one, because the first commandment is, you must not have any other gods but me. The second one, you must not make for yourself an idol of any kind. The Egyptians worshipped many gods. About as many things as there were in the earth, the Egyptians had a god that they would worship for that. These gods didn't care about them, but you had to appease them in order to avoid suffering. And so God sets this guideline of saying, hey, I want to make it clear. I know that for the last hundreds of years, you have lived in a culture that has said that there are many gods and you need to work to keep them happy with you. But you should only worship the one true God. This is the guideline for you now. This is how you get out of the old way of thinking into a new reality. In Egypt, there was no Sabbath, and especially for slaves, there was not a break. There was no day off. You were only as valuable as you were able to create and to put work out into the world and into the society. So another 10 commandment God gives is to say, hey, you need to take a break. You need to rest. You need to learn that you are more valuable than just whatever it is you do. You have worth and value. In Egyptian culture, you could take anything you wanted from someone that was less powerful or less educated than you. If you had the means to take it, you had the right to take it. And so this is why they say it is not okay. You must not covet your neighbor's wife. It goes on, and also up there with the wife is your neighbor's donkey and your neighbor's calf and all these other things, because in Egyptian culture, it was okay just to take the things that you wanted if you could take it. And God is setting these parameters and saying, this is going to give you the guidelines, the North Star for how to be different, to experience a different reality, one that God truly wanted for his family. He wanted their lives to be different. These weren't random ideas. They were all cultural critiques. They were a way of saying, we, the people of God, we are going to be different. We are going to live differently in this culture, in this world around us. We are going to be different. In fact, there's examples even in the New Testament of Jesus giving these same types of critiques. He would do it to the political powers. He would even do it to the religious institutions. In Matthew 20, I don't have this on your screens, but Jesus is talking with the disciples and he calls them together. And it says, Jesus said to them, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles, aka the political powers, the authority in the land, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them." So he's just saying, hey, this is what society looks like. This is what culture looks like. Then he says, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And he goes on. He says, this is what culture looks like. You're going to be different inside of the culture. I need you to figure out a different way to exist. I need you to figure out a different way to show up. Just because this is what culture or society or government or whatever it is, just because this is what it is out there, it does not mean that that's what we do. We find a different way. Just because they're doing it doesn't mean we can do it. Just because your friend's parents let you or let them do whatever it is doesn't mean in the Kretsu house we do things differently. Not that different. We eat way too much and we watch a lot of TV. But there's these things. I mean, every family understands this concept of in our house we do things differently. It doesn't matter the way people do things out there. And the same thing, God does the same thing with Israel. He's saying, hey, you are going to come into contact with so many different cultures and nations and religions and concepts and ideologies and philosophies, and I want to break it down for you. This is the way. This is how you move forward. This is how you grow in the wholeness, the desire that I have for you to become. The laws in the Bible, they didn't seek to restructure society, but to change how God's people live and think in the society that they live in. This is all throughout the Old Testament. Over and over again, we are not called to fight culture. We are not called to run or hide from culture. We are called to live differently inside of the culture that we exist in. For us, that's California, in America. For other people, it's different states. It's different countries. We're called to show up differently inside of the culture. And here's how this applies to our families, because we are still talking about family. To become who God has called you to be, we have got to learn how to live in opposition to some of the unhealthy instincts that we have inherited. We have to learn how to live in opposition to some of the unhealthy ways of thinking, the unhealthy ways of relating, the unhealthy ways of arguing, the unhealthy ways of loving, the unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict, the unhealthy ways of dealing with money, whatever the thing is, for us to become who God is calling us to be, a chosen people, his children, regardless of what race or nationality or what our past is, we are called to live differently inside of a context. And that causes us to say, hey, I have got to change some things. I've got to set some parameters in place. This is true for us as parents. It's really obvious that we have to set some guidelines for our kids, but this is true for us as we parent ourselves, as we continue to grow and develop as individuals. Some of us are very motivated to never be like our parents, to never be like them, to do things as differently as we can. And so what happens oftentimes is we swing way out the other way. Some of us are very motivated to never date someone like our ex again. And so the next time we find someone to date, we pick someone who is just the total opposite of the person we dated last time. We're swinging so far this way or so far that way. And in my experience, it is never enough to know what you don't want to be. It's not enough just to say, I don't want to be like my parents. It's not enough just to say, I don't want to be this type of spouse. It's not enough just to say, I don't want to date this kind of person. You have got to say, this is who I want to be. In our lives, we need something to run towards, not just something to run from. The thing about Israel, finally free after hundreds of years of slavery, what type of healthy, reasonable boundaries do you think they would give themselves? First time you get to do whatever you want. Probably none. What type of healthy, reasonable boundaries do you think that your child who just turned 18 and moved away to college is going to give themselves? I mean, this is every parent's fear. It's like they have all the freedom now. There is nobody watching over them to make sure that they stay safe and get home on time and eat something besides Twinkies and Pop-Tarts, which was all I ate my first year of college. The ability to say, I'm going to choose whatever I want in that space, it makes sense. So it's not enough to try and move away from something. We have got to decide, what is it we are going to move towards? Who do we want to become? What do we want to be about? Who do we want to define us? What do we want people to associate us with? We have to have a clear picture of what we are for, not just what we are against. And for Jesus followers, the picture could not be more clearer. We are supposed to look like Christ. We are supposed to be like Christ. Being a Christian is about following Jesus in the way that we live, not just about having the right beliefs so that we get into heaven when we die. It's not just about knowing the 10 Commandments. It's about living in a way that emulates how Jesus lived. Believing the right thing doesn't matter if you aren't living the right way. Knowing the right answers doesn't matter if you're not living the right way. And this isn't my idea. James, the half-brother of Jesus, said this in James chapter 2. He said, just as the body is dead without breath, so also faith is dead without good works. There's a sense it doesn't matter how much of the correct information you know if you are not living your life in the same way. So we've got to set these parameters in place. Jesus addressed this too in Luke chapter 6. He says, what good is it to mouth the words, Lord, Lord, if you don't live by my teachings? Because what matters is that you come to me, hear my words, and, this would be the important part, actually live by them. It doesn't matter if you know them. What I'm looking for is for you to live a different way, for you to become different than your natural preference, your natural habits, your natural inclination. You have to hear what I'm saying and then choose to live a different way. This is what we want for our kids as we help them grow up and develop, and this is the same thing that God wants for his kids, for you and for I. He says, if you do that, you'll be like the man who wanted to build a sturdy house. He dug down deep and anchored his foundation to solid rock. During a violent storm, the floodwaters slammed against the house, but they couldn't shake it because it was built upon a rock. On the other hand, if you hear my teachings but don't put them into practice, you will be like the careless builder who didn't bother to build a foundation under his house. The floodwaters barely touched that pathetic house, and it crashed in ruins in the mud. Jesus is saying, here's the situation. I get that society, that culture, that your parents, the family you were raised in, the friends that you have, the type of person you want to become, everybody has these different brands, this style, this desire of how they want to do things. But what I need you to do is not only just listen to my words, but actually start to put them into place. And when you start to put them into action, when a violent storm or a pandemic or a terrible election year, or like Jamie shared earlier, physical illness and injury, or financial destitution, or relational strain, when these things start to come and impact us, because they will, they have and they will, when we experience those things, the way that we are able to stand strong is by taking the words of Christ, knowing them, and putting them into action. This is what we are called to do. Our singular goal as followers of Jesus is to hear his words and to live by them, to be more like Christ. So people don't know this, but the word Christian really means little Christ. And it actually started as an insult. The Roman people would see Christians. They didn't actually know who they were. They would see these people and they would say, there go those little Christs again, which kind of sounds inappropriate to say. I've asked my children to call me little Christ. I'm just kidding. They would see people and based on how they were living, based off of who they were talking to, based off of how they were caring for people that were hurting or broken or ill or poor or whatever it was, they would say, there goes another little Christ loving people again. Like it was a problem. Because it was. Because that society, that culture didn't care about that at all. They had no value in that. And so they would look at these fools, these little Christs that were caring for slaves and respecting women and talking to people from other nationalities. This is what it means to be a Christian, is to be so obviously, visibly different than the rest of our culture, because not only of what we hear, but the way that we live, that from across a parking lot, somebody could be like, there goes another little Christ. And the insult became a badge of honor, because what more could you want than to be associated with Jesus? The only thing in the Christian faith that everybody can agree on is good. The only thing that even atheists would say, yeah, a lot of great teachings from him. The only thing across the board for us to be associated with, what greater desire or honor or preference would we have than to hear the words of Jesus and then to actually put them into action? So, we talk about this in light of our families, kids, relationships, marriages. We talk about this in light of ourselves. Parameters, the values that we have got to figure out, what are we going to put into place? Now, some of these may not be overtly spiritual for our family. Some of us need to figure out, okay, we're going to put in a new value, and we're going to say no phones at the table. We're going to say, we're going to actually sit at a table. We're going to do a date night once a week. We're going to, whatever it might be, we're going to join a small group. There's all kinds of different things. Some of these values, it's not that phones at the table in and of itself is going to ruin your family, but when you say, hey, here's the parameter we're going to put in place, and it allows us to live differently. It's not a small group is going to cause you to be a Christian. It's saying, hey, here's the value that I have, and it's going to cause me to be connected to other people that are moving the same direction. It is parameters that point us in the direction we want to go. We've got to figure out, what are these things for us as individuals, for us as adults, as family members, as parents, as spouses and friends and roommates. What are the parameters that will help us become more like Christ and healthier in our relationships, to point ourselves and our family in a direction other than where everybody else is going? Practically speaking, there's an author and speaker named Tim Elmore, and he wrote a book called Artificial Maturity, and they did all kinds of studies that he ended up turning into this book. And what they learned were the most atrophied values in children and adults. So these are the values that both kids and adults across the country struggle with the most. These are the ones that are missing the most. And he elaborated on how to fight to rebuild those things. So we're going to put them on the screen, but some of these, they may ring a bell for you as a person, or maybe even in your family as you deal with kids or whatever it might be. The first one that he saw that was struggling, this atrophied value in our culture, is patience. And he said to experience more patience in our hearts, to become more patient, we have to fight by taking hold of delayed gratification. And that word doesn't even sound fun. I mean, delayed gratification, it's like, give me a break. I don't even want to say all of those syllables. That's how impatient I am. He said to become more patient, we have to fight by embracing delayed gratification, the ability to wait on an award that comes slowly. Now, we have to figure out, how do we exercise this, and how do we provide this type of foundation for our kids if we're parents? How do we provide this kind of foundation for ourselves if as adults? How do we provide this kind of foundation for our relationships if we're dating or married? How do we implement this idea of delayed gratification so we can become more patient? The second one is connectivity, and I'm not talking about your cell signal. He's saying connectivity, the way we relate with other people, and the way that we find more connectivity in our lives is by fighting with people skills, by pursuing people skills, the ability to build common ground with people that are not like you. And could there be anything more needed in 2020 than building common ground with people that are not like you? Connectivity is obviously a massive struggle for people. Responsibility is a third one. We pursue morals and ethics, the ability to do what's right, even when you are acting alone, by being responsible. Endurance, to fight with tenacity, the ability to stay committed and complete the work towards a goal. This idea, all of these really, I mean, you could talk about these with 9-year-olds, you could talk about these with 90-year-olds. All of these are challenges. Empathy is the last one I'll talk through. It says we find empathy when we lean into compassion and perspective, the ability to see and feel what others see and feel. Again, this is not just building relationships with people that are different from us, but this is actually figuring out, help me understand why you feel this way. Help me understand why you think this way. Not in a, like, help me understand how you could be so crazy, but in a, like, help me understand. I know you. I love you. I care about you. I believe in you. Help me understand how you got to this place. These are just a few of the most atrophied values in our culture. Each one of these things specifically, to be a struggle with any of these things would be a struggle for us as followers of Jesus. These all are deeply connected to our ability to be little Christ. The things that I want for my kids, the things that I want for my marriage, the things that I'd like to experience for myself, they all are on this list. These are all things that I would like to have more of. I feel like I could say that probably the same is true for each of us. We need to push back against what is easy and what is familiar and what's comfortable, not just going with the flow, not being obsessed with everyone else's values and what other people are doing right or wrong. We get so worked up about other people that we forget how we are acting and how we are living. So the question I want to end with is, what would it look like for you and for I to set up parameters, to set up guidelines, to create a North Star for us and say, this is what is going to keep us on track? Because if we don't have parameters, if we don't have guidelines, and we won't even know when we're off track, we're just out there. What are the guidelines? What are the parameters? What are the rules, the laws, the values that we can put into place and say, I can actually follow up on this. I can see how I'm doing on these things. And the challenge and the invitation for us as Jesus followers is to make sure that those things are pushing us into becoming more and more like Christ. And so my invitation is for each of us to wrestle with that this week. Let's pray together.